Terrorism in various forms has been with us throughout recorded military history. Only in the past 100 years, however, has the object of terrorism been the civilian population. This episode describes how this fits within the ancient art of modern warfare and why understanding that is important. I'm Chris Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry retired, and in this series I explain the enduring philosophy of war, as it was, as it is, and will continue to be regardless of advances in weaponry or politics. I was going to continue this series by describing how terrorism developed in the 20th century to be as we know it today. I decided that listeners would rather learn how modern terrorism affects warfare today than hear more of its history. So I threw out the previous script and started all over again. In the last episode, I described how terrorism changed from assassination of military and political leaders to accepting incidental civilian casualties, to making non-combatant civilians the principal target of terrorism, and why. As I usually do, I'm going to take a step back to Clausewitz and describe how this contemporary international terrorism actually fits within our understanding of the philosophy of war. By understanding how it fits, we might be better able to develop counter-strategies, defeating the terrorists and their goals. To repeat what I've said many times in these podcasts, Clausewitz teaches that war is a continuation of policy with the addition of other means. That means is violence. But that application of violence does not set aside other tools of policy. They continue to be important. All elements of national power working together to achieve the desired end state of that policy. These tools, violence, with the addition of economic factors, diplomacy, and the full spectrum of information in all of its forms, is intended to create as much pain for our opponent that he would prefer to give in to our demands, that is, to accept our policy objectives, rather than continue to resist. And this is precisely the intent of modern terrorism. Traditionally, the center of mass of national power was the armed forces of a state. Without those armed forces, the state, its resources, land, and people are defenseless. Therefore, the objective in war was the destruction of the enemy's armed forces. This continues to be true in wars such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The actors that use terrorism as a war form either do not have the strength to take on the military force of their opponents, or they wish to avoid overt participation in combat or direct attribution for that violence. Terrorism as a war form, therefore, avoids direct confrontation with superior military forces. Targeting the civilian population is easier and less risky. The terrorist strategy identifies the center of mass of its opponent not as the opponent's armed forces, but as the people. Rather than the destruction of that center of mass, as is the case when attacking the armed forces of a state, terrorism seeks to cause enough pain through direct attack on the civilian population. In attacking the civilian population, the terrorist intends to demonstrate unconstrained power to force the civilian population to submit to their control over them, or to get the government to submit to avoid further harm to the civilian population which it depends upon for support, whether that support is political, economic, or a combination thereof. This unconstrained force is similar to the Powell Doctrine's concept of using overwhelming force, but in a way that completely disregards the humanity of its victims and the mores of civilization, including the law of war. This strategy can be successful, but several factors must exist. First, the opposing government must be responsive to their population. That means democracies and constitutional republics. Totalitarian governments are more resistant to terrorist attack. Second, similar to military forces, terrorist organizations must be adequately organized, equipped, and trained. Terrorism must work as part of an organization that is directing the policy goal that terrorism seeks to achieve. It must have adequate funding sources to provide it the weapons it needs for the terrorist attacks, along with other necessary supplies and materiel. It must have adequate planning and intelligence capability to identify an appropriate target for violence, one that is likely to generate the desired effect and which has a high probability of success. This organization must include the capacity to employ the other elements of strategic power to achieve its goals. It must have diplomatic representation, either of its own or through a supporting government or international organization. It must have the capability to conduct information operations to capitalize on its successes, spin its defeats, and convince the populations which suffer from its attacks that the terrorist organization is really on their side, or if not, that even more brutal attacks are coming. Now, these capabilities don't necessarily reside in the command structure of the terrorist organization. They might come from a state that is also engaged in armed conflict with the government the terrorist is targeting. It could come from another state which is using the terrorists as a proxy for that state's own interest, not wanting to engage in direct confrontation with a particular opponent or that opponent's more capable allies. These capabilities could also come from a state or international organization which is merely shielding the terrorist organization without providing direct support. The support needed by the terrorist organization could, instead, come from the private sector or third parties within the territory of that state or international organization, but are not being directly controlled by those entities. Going back to the tactical level, the terrorists conducting the attack must be trained with the weapons to be used and the tactics, techniques, and procedures necessary to employ those weapons successfully. This training could be in-house, provided by a sponsoring state, foreign volunteers, or even from the private sector. Third, it must have a secure base of operations to attack from and retreat to after the attack is complete. This could be a protecting power, a remote area of the state in which the terrorists are operating, or in a third neutral state that does not know or have the means to track down and stop its territory from being used in that way. History and current events provide examples of all of these possibilities for organization, equipping, and training terrorists. One other very important factor in terrorist success is that the population to be attacked must be vulnerable. Now, vulnerability could be perceived in different ways, one being whether the unconstrained attack is likely to compel the population to submit or at least cause disaffection with their government, or whether instead it will engender resistance and foster unity with their government. Equally, if not more important, is whether the population is a hard or a soft target. Attacking a target where there is military, paramilitary, or competent police present is risky at best. A population that is armed and trained to quickly act as a militia is even more dangerous and would dissuade all but the strongest terrorist forces. Many terrorist organizations are unable to effectively access or balance all of these requirements. According to the United Nations, 4 out of 5 terrorist attacks are unsuccessful. Someone once said, however, that the terrorist only needs to be successful once. In summary, terrorism as a war form fits within the traditional philosophy of war. The goal of terrorist attacks is to use violence in combination with the other elements of strategic power to achieve specific policy objectives. The violence is intended to cause enough pain to the opposing government that it will submit to the terrorist demands rather than continuing to resist. Terrorist strategy, therefore, is based on the traditional triangle of ends, ways, and means. It must, however, have the organization, funding, other logistic support, and training so that violence leads to success. Terrorism is asymmetric warfare, but it is warfare, and the fundamental principles of war still apply. I will move on from here to explore how this asymmetry has its own weaknesses and how we can exploit them.